Good morning and welcome to the BCS 2020 conference for the Specialist Group for Service Management and ITAM. And this year's conference title is the Digital Workplace Revolution. Obviously, we've got lots of stuff going on around the digital changes and the pandemic that maybe has accelerated that. So we want to hear what's happening for people across different industries and the impact that that's having. We've got Duncan this morning who's going to talk to us about the employee impact, which is one aspect of what's happening, obviously, across all of the changes that are occurring. Just to let you know, I'm Marilyn Burt. I'm the Vice Chair of this specialist group, and I'm hosting the conference today here for you in this session. And I've got Ian Robinson on with me, who you can probably also see on webcam there. And we'll be both finishing this or going through this introductory session and hosting any questions for you when you put them in the question and answer box, question box later, and I'll explain that to you in a few minutes' time. So who are we at the BCS? We're a specialist group that just has merged recently with the service management group. And previously we were the configuration management group who hosted the IT asset management, formerly or also known as the SAM group. So we cover quite a bit of broad aspects now of the ITIL procedures and your service management areas. We're actually a volunteer group, but we do host on a regular basis networking events, usually face-to-face, but this year we've had to go online, obviously. And these professional development events are often from some of our experts in software asset management, service management, license management, you know, specific aspects around great topics that everyone really loves, like the Oracle licensing, how to understand Oracle and how to understand SAP licensing. So do look out for those things as we post them throughout the year. We try to do it once a month and alternate between either licensing one month and another month to do configuration or service management. You can find information about us on LinkedIn, also from the About page of the conference website that you have just made your booking through. On that page, there's a link to connect you through to us if you'd like to join our group. And there's also links that take you through to the LinkedIn areas for us as well. Our BCS page is represented from that link you click through as well. So far for this conference, we've released the keynote, which hopefully you've watched already, by the lovely Claire Orgutta. And that was pre-recorded, and so obviously there weren't any live questions at that, but Claire is going to be back with us on our Wednesday final session, which is the panel where we've got most of our presenters coming back to help with the takeaway session, which is going to be the summary of all of their presentations across the week, and also allow you to ask more questions. And that's where we're going to pull it all together and find out what's really, you know, the impacts that are happening in the industry, and what are the things that we're going to be able to keep, and how do we need to take action to keep some of those things that have been a benefit to us from these digital changes that are occurring. So hopefully, if you want to see that keynote, you can look at that from either the LinkedIn Service Management Group, or you can get that from the homepage as well, or the keynote page on our website. So just quickly to show you, we've got 3 sessions every day. There's one at 10 o'clock, there's one at 1 o'clock, and there's one at 16:30, all British Standard Time. We are global this year. We've got presenters from US, we've got presenters from New Zealand, and presenters from India. So we've obviously got a big audience from all around the world as well. So hopefully we've got get you all joining up with us and becoming active members of our community as well. Today we've got Duncan, like I said, talking about the employee experience. 1 o'clock today we've got Jim Hussey, who's presenting from the US on the survival guide to SaaS. At 18:30 we've got Mark Harrison in New Zealand, who's presenting on enterprise service management. Tomorrow 10 o'clock we've got Amit Verma presenting from India on mergers and acquisitions. 1 o'clock we've got Jonathan Lipton, who's presenting on full stack outsourcing. 18:30 tomorrow night we've got Desiree Weiss, who is presenting on SAP, vendor management, governance, licensing and service management. I don't know how she's going to fit that into 1 hour because it's such a big topic, but we'll see how she goes. So please do join us for that one. Wednesday is our session, 10 o'clock. We've got Hannah Price talking about hero culture, a damaging mentality for collaboration and success at service management area. At 1 o'clock, we've got Oliver Cronk, who's talking about the evolution of business as usual. And like I said, at 18:30, we've got the panel and takeaway session where Richard Josie, who's our chair, will be hosting that session with all of the panelists who are able to return. We'll talk about give you a little bit of an overview for any of the sessions that you've missed by just having one slide that we pop up for you, and just give you a few words about each presentation, and then we'll go into your questions. So if you do miss any of the sessions, they are all being recorded, but they won't be available for about 3 weeks' time for you to watch. There's a bit of a backlog because everyone's digital at the moment, and everyone's using the BCS for our presentations. So we've got them, we're relying on them to put together these videos for us and make them active on our webpage, but they will be available for you to watch or rewatch. And just a couple of things then. Like I said, if you're interested in joining our group, do click to connect to us through our About page on the conference website. And just a couple of things about today. The format for today, we're going to have places where your questions will be presented to Duncan and he will answer them. And he's going to have like a slide that will pop up and we will ask him the questions. So what we need you to do is put your questions in the question box, not the chat box, the question box, which you'll find from the panel on your whichever side you've got it on your GoToWebinar screen. And this morning's session is going to be just short of an hour because it depends on how many questions you've got for Duncan. And I'm now going to hand over to the lovely Ian Robertson, who is going to introduce our presenter for you today. Enjoy the session.
Thank you, Marilyn. I think everybody will be admit that since March, the environment in which we live and work has changed dramatically with events worldwide. It's changed the landscape a lot. I've been working at home for the first time since March. So it's really important that people support each other in these challenging times. And the best way people can support each other is by delivering performance, supporting the business, looking after well-being. So today I'm delighted that we've got Duncan Watkins with us to talk about employee experience and bringing your best self to work. Duncan is an experienced service management professional. He's also known as the James Hunt of the ITSM world. Duncan, we're delighted you're here, so over to you, thanks.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Marilyn, as well. That's a great introduction. So, yeah, as Ian explained and Marilyn explained, to talk to you today about employee experience and really how the world has changed, how, in a way, everything has changed with COVID, but in a way, nothing has changed, and the same challenges are still there. They've just been accelerated, and we're having to move through them quicker. So, any of you who's seen, I guess, any sort of Forrester presentation before will know we've been talking about the age of the customer for sort of many years. Our research has repeatedly shown a correlation between companies that are good at customer experience and then an increase in their revenue and their profits. A lot of our clients have focused on customer experience in recent years, and the best really build it in as an ongoing core competency and measure their teams and their executives, employees, through customer experience and how well they do that. More recently, though, we've seen an increased importance in employee experience and how that ties into company success and also well-being. Our research again has demonstrated a correlation between an increase in revenue and great employee experience. But things like high employee retention, high engagement of employees, and being a sought-after place to work has always been desirable. We've always, those are the places we want to work. But increasingly, we see this connection between kind of good EX, good customer experience, and then wider organizational outcomes and achieving the things you want to achieve. Now, in the current world, the last thing to add into this mix is the effects of COVID-19. Whilst most organizations have always understood that employee experience is important, they hadn't necessarily prioritized it over things like customer experience until now. COVID-19 has highlighted just how important employee experience is to employers, because you have to offer work from home options for many or all of your employees, and that really had to happen in, for some organizations, the space of a few days or a few weeks. So a real change in the landscape. What happened was this led to employers finally understanding that their employees are what we like to call modern purpose workers, and really should be measured on things like outcomes and not the sort of very old-fashioned Tayloristic ideas of time and motion of, you must be in the office at these arbitrary set times in order to do your best work. As a real example, the reason I've got headphones on today is because I happen to have a carpenter downstairs who's doing some drilling and doing a load of work. So apologies for any background noise, but it just demonstrates the adaptability and the way we have to work in a much different way now, because so many of us are working from home, and because that is a much different experience to working in the office. So fortunately for me, I've got the power to set my own diary, and so I can build in time to go and check the work as the day goes on, but also make sure I achieve the outcomes I'm meant to in my job. Okay, so those are really the three things that set the scene for today. Now, the coronavirus pandemic's really created these changes at workplace at the pace we've never really seen before. I'm always a little bit nervous about using the term unprecedented because none of us know really what the future holds, but it's affected almost all of us in a very short space of time. Now, for most organizations, this has led to a new way of engaging with customers. Typically, you're going much more through digital channels, whether you have retail stores or not. It's also meant that engagement needs to be more empathetic. It's not just a case of if as long as I put my products out there, they're going to sell. You have to understand how the lives of your customers have changed, so that you can give them experiences that they want. On the other side, our engagement with our colleagues has changed massively as well. More of it is things like this. It's distance online forms of collaboration rather than face-to-face that up to March we would do most of our work with. It also means that management has to be much more trusting and empathetic, because it's harder to keep track of what workers are doing. So we've seen this change to the way we engage with customers. We've seen changes in the way we work together, and we've seen changes to the way managers must manage their employees. And it's clear that that has driven both customer experience and employee experience up the agenda. Okay, so this has led businesses really, or this situation has led businesses to get into one of three modes initially: survival mode, adaptive mode, or growth mode. Now, those in survival mode are those businesses who've really had a tough time during the virus. And typically we see this with things like travel firms or airlines. And it's been a really hard time for them, and they've had to deal with quite significant changes. Those in adaptive mode, I guess, are a bigger chunk of the world and are coping, but have to change what they do. This will characterize a lot of the firms that you are probably working, or we'll see if that's true, as you move away from office working and begin to understand what that means for the people, the technology, the processes that you use within your organization. The ones in growth mode are the ones who've been very lucky and benefited from the changes brought about by the pandemic. A very obvious example of this is Zoom. It kind of became the new Hoover, but for video conferencing rather than vacuuming. Just to highlight the difference between them, as many of you will have seen, way back in May, Zoom stock became worth more than the 7 largest airlines in the world. So this really has turned a lot of things on its head in the modern world. Now, we've got a little poll here, which should be interesting just to find out from you where you each are in survival or adaptive mode or growth. So on your right-hand side in the drop-down menu, you should see a poll option with polls in there. If you would kindly click on where you think you are. So is your business in survival mode? Is your business in adaptive mode? Or are you one of the lucky ones whose businesses are in growth mode? I'll just give you a minute or so to put the answers into there. And then when we're done with that, we'll just see what the results are and see kind of how you're coping and how things are going. So thank you. Yeah. Okay, so last sort of 10 seconds for the last few to get your answers in.
You can see that's coming up as 70% adaptive mode there, and 20%
Yeah.
survival and 10% growth.
Yeah, and this is fairly typical of what we've seen, Marilyn. So, as I said, most organizations are in that adaptive mode. So they are having to change what they do. Some of it has been a bit of a scramble, but they really are changing the way they operate their processes, changing the way they deal with their people to cope with this kind of, this new paradigm that is brought about by COVID.
Duncan, in the organisation I work for, we have been in adaptive mode, particularly with employees who've never worked at home before, needing to work from home. On the other hand, because we've seen an increase in demand for our services from an external customer, we're in rapid growth mode, but I think we're still playing catch up for adaptive mode for our employees.
Yeah, and as I talked about in the kind of previous slide, there's three things going on there. We're having to change how we deal with our employees, and almost typically, whatever organisation you are, you're having to ramp up the amount of digital channels you've got engaging with employees. I know in kind of in your world, Ian, a lot of it will be a lot of about information, people not knowing what they can do, so they'll be asking those sorts of questions. But also, as you said, that working with employees, you're asking them to work in a very different way, and it can be quite hard, particularly when you're a large organisation. How do you make sure that you're able to support people to change this new way of work? Because for some it's quite daunting. They feel it. When we talk about experience, we talk about good experiences through three lenses: effectiveness, ease, and emotion. Effectiveness and ease, I think, are ones we understand very well in kind of IT management, because we build systems to be like that. But it's the emotion bit that sometimes we can forget, and that's a key part of getting your employees to adapt. And again, smaller numbers for survival and growth mode. For survival mode, my heart goes out to you, because it's really been hard for some organisations, and the number ones we deal with are in that situation. And the first couple of months were just about how do we kind of survive as a business. Unfortunately, we're starting to see some now, almost, some of them will have pivoted what they do and are starting to move into adaptive mode. So they may change to much more of an online service. So to give you an example, if you are a travel firm, you might be used to things like selling things like package holidays or idea, that sort of business, and perhaps pivoting to be much more, or bring something online like a bookings.com or that sort of idea, where you're changing the way you essentially sell what you do. We've kind of seen that change, and those in the growth mode is obviously very encouraging for those companies that the demand that's come about from this pandemic has helped them grow. But again, there's difficulties for them as well. Organizations that are in growth mode, as we know, with any organization that grows, it's very hard to grow quickly, because you're having to throw a lot of resources into almost a kind of little slightly unknown world. So not an untypical poll result there. We typically see adaptive as being the largest chunk, and then obviously a sixth in survival and a sixth in growth.
Okay. Duncan, would you be able to share the results on screen? We just had a question from somebody saying they can't see the results.
Oh, okay.
Publish the poll.
Okay, if I close it and then share it. So there we go. You able to see it now?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, apologies. That was again a technology failure on my part. There you go. Yeah. So majority in adaptive mode. We obviously see some in survival and some in growth, and this will drastically affect how you deal with the situation. Okay. Thank you all for putting your results in there. That's really interesting to see that this audience is fairly, I guess fairly typical of what we're seeing in a wider world. So we know this is a situation. What do we have to do now to think about how we can survive in this mode, and how we can move forward? So, which one? Here we go. So firstly, I'm going to talk about sort of some lessons we can learn from before. some of the shocks that we're seeing come about from, some of the shocks we're seeing coming about, and also some of the fears that employees are articulating to us. So the first thing to say is, one thing we can learn is the closest kind of comparison really is where it's at play in the 20s, and there were factors in play then that are still in play today. So for in March this year, we did a US survey. We looked at what the effect of the pandemic was on organizations and also employees and how they felt about their organizations. What was interesting was only 43% of workers believed their company had a plan for the pandemic. Only 48% had confidence in their company's leader to handle things. And just 55% believed their company would put their well-being first when making decisions. So they're all around kind of half employees there, but the alarm bell's clear. Employees don't, or a number of employees don't believe their companies have the strategy, have the leadership and the empathy to lead them through the situation. So this is where we can look to somewhere like the 20s to see it, to give us an indicator of what to do. So the 20s really emerged from the First World War and the devastation that was caused by the Spanish flu pandemic. But by the end of the decade, we generated unprecedented global prosperity. So despite that hard start, the decade saw GDP grow at higher levels than ever seen before. So how did that happen? Well, one of the interesting things about the 20s is the recovery was fueled by technology, which is what we're seeing today as well. Now, the technologies were obviously different, but they undoubtedly drove things like innovation at that time. You know, back then there were really 4 key technologies that led the change in the 20s. So things like the rise of the affordable automobile, the mass electrification of households brought a massive change, emergence of radio was important, and the creation of cross-country telephone networks was really important as well. So these technological changes then led to further boons in related areas. So in terms of purchasing, things like consumer credit really developed over this decade, and also the expansion of international trade really ramped up during the 20s. But what it shows us is that technology can be a key driver in coming out of situations like this. One of the other interesting things in the 20s is people really embraced change in how they lived and how they worked. So because of the drastic things that happened, you know, with the First World War and the flu pandemic, consumers were really ready to recover from that past and turn to tools around them to really change their lives. So the automobile, for example, enabled a lot more flexibility in personal living, allowing individuals to move to areas where employee prospects were better, as opposed to staying in the area you'd kind of always lived. They used technologies like radio to experience their lives differently and connect to people and issues that they felt mattered. And also new money in their pocket as this growth happened really helped them to experiment in how they would run their lives. But one of the most interesting is the third real factor, and that's that employees started to invest in employers, started to invest in employees really well, to a degree, whether they wanted to or not. An example of this was Henry Ford raised wages in his factory, but there's real 3 main reasons for that. The first was by raising those wages, many employees could afford to buy his cars, which was quite canny. Secondly, by putting his wages ahead of the Chicago stockyards and meatpacking factories, his main competitors, he was able to compete against them. But also lastly, by paying them more, he attracted and kept the best of those employees. What this did was it forced others to keep up with him, and this change in dynamic shifted the relationship between employer and employee. So it started to give employees much more power in that relationship. And it'd be interesting to see if that happens as this pandemic moves through. So if those are the things we can start to learn from the 20s, what are the shocks today that really will affect how we come out of this pandemic and how employee experience changes over the next few years? So the first one is one that we have to acknowledge, and that's called systemic risk. So the global nature of this pandemic makes every company potentially exposed. In the 20s, they also paid attention to sort of global risk factors to reduce risk, but they also tried to pivot and explore new economic niches, and really the 20s more than ever saw an investment in meeting the needs of customers who also were going through enormous changes. So the workforce changes we need now needs to pay attention to both consumer power and employee power, but think about these system-wide forces of both politics and environmental nature that will affect us all. Robots and automation are also an important one at the moment. They haven't really begun to make their feeling present in organizations as they will in the near future. We've done some research and suggests that automation will affect, in some way, not completely swap out, but in some way will affect up to 80% of jobs. Many of the things your workforce do today can be done better or more cheaply by robots or artificial intelligence. So that's an important factor that we have to think about today and how we come out of this pandemic. The third interesting factor for employee experience is just the sheer amount of data that we have about employees now. So the employee data we have now is really slowly starting to drown us in obligations and possibilities. We already collect more data about our workforce than we really know how to deal with. So most organizations, are still coming to terms with how to manage their employee data just to lower the risks, let alone understand how that can increase motivation and productivity amongst their employees. So this is an interesting shift that's happening now in the world. And lastly, what I mentioned before is employee power, and really this will help to redefine our workforce strategies. As in the age and the shift of the customer, personal technology stacks empower employees to track organizations' deeds and see how we feel about them, for example, on social media. So even if employees approve your company's politics, they might feel underappreciated, and they'll use their own biometrics and skills assessments to conclude whether they can contribute with you or contribute better elsewhere. Things like very simple things like Glassdoor allow you to look at people's experience with other organizations. But there's a wide range of things you can look at yourself now to work out what you think about your organizations and rival organizations and decide where you would like to sit in your employment. So these four factors are really dramatically affecting how the employee experience will have to be in the near future. And then there's obviously the experience of the employees themselves. So when thinking about this, it's not just possible to think of those external factors. You have to think of the internal factors of what your employees are thinking. This pandemic has made a lot of people very, very uncertain about their futures, and certainly more uncertain than they have been for many years. So what do you need to think about in the way you treat your employees in terms of the fears that they currently have? So one of those fears is really about job losses in search of corporate profit. So many companies at the moment are sort of playing a sort of finite game. So they're managing to maybe this year's results or even their quarterly financial targets, rather than thinking about the long term and how they get returns over that long term. When you fall into these ideas, sort of short-term, near-term target idea, the pressure mounts then onto course correct when you have a poor financial quarter. This instinctively feeds through to employees who feel jobs are at risk whenever there's a dip in financial performance. So as you set your employee experience, you have to think about that. As you mentioned before, robots are important, and some workers fear losing their jobs or the relevancy in the face of robots and artificial intelligence. Pew Research did a research in Japan, and that found that 89% of workers felt that jobs humans currently do will either probably or definitely be replaced by robots within the next 50 years. Now, whether that plays out or not is not the important bit. It's the fact that people feel that way that's important to how you set your employee experience. Even if people don't lose their jobs, it's clear they don't necessarily see a clear path forward. The third factor is really they're worried about being stripped of their value in things like transformation. So 68% of decision makers tell us that their company's currently going through a digital transformation, and I would say realistically, at the moment, that's probably even higher. In reality, most of you will have gone through some sort of digital change this year because of the effect of the pandemic. As you try and transform to being customer-centric, innovative, agile, digital, all these kind of buzzwords, some of your employees will start to feel threatened, and their management as well will start to feel a bit overwhelmed with all that change. So there are threats both outside your organization, within your organization, to making your employee experience the one that you would like. So, Marilyn, Ian, I think that's a good point to just pause to see if there are any questions that come up. But if anybody hasn't any questions, have a think about the couple on the screen and just think to yourself whether you are. So sorry, Marilyn, please go on.
Yeah, we've got a couple of comments here. David Norfolk says to us, in the 1920s, wasn't there more of a step change in technology? And now we're seeing an expansion of existing technologies. And then he also comments as well, saying, I think there'll be a fifth shock, as in continuing pandemics every few years.
Yeah, no, and both those comments are correct. So, going back to the first comment about technological change, I think when you're in the midst of technological change, you don't necessarily feel it because it feels gradual, but actually there will be some, certainly the change from robots and AI will start to accelerate over the next few years, but it will feel to a degree fairly gradual because it will happen in organizations that you'll have visibility of it. But that technological change, David's right in a way in that the technological change of the 20s were really dramatic. They're really significant. Whereas I think today we are used to a continual change in technology, and people are perhaps a bit more comfortable with it. Going back to the idea of the pandemic, that fits in with my systemic risk, with the environmental and political nature of the changes that happen outside your organization. So pandemic is going to be, recurring pandemics is going to be important. The continual risks of the climate crisis are going to be things that you have to take aware of. From a very fundamental point of view, just to make sure your organization can survive, but also from the point of view that your employees will want to work for an organization that shows sustainability as an important factor. And again, that will be increasingly important. So yeah, very, very good point. Thank you, David.
Duncan, in one of your questions, what has your firm done in our organisation in terms of employee experience during the pandemic? Instead of saying you will work from home continuously, we're giving employees a choice so they can try it, either on a week at home, a week at work, or a day at work, 4 days at home. So giving the employees a greater choice in how they manage their work environment helps towards giving them a better user experience.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the correct thing to do, because one of the things that changed in the employee experience is, whereas before we used to dictate, right, you are now going to work in this way, or this is the way you have to work. That's what turns employees off and makes them leave. If you give them options, the two things happen. One is they will decide which is better for them along their personal circumstances. So, for example, if I haven't got childcare, I may need to stay at home, but if I have, I will go into work. But the second thing is that it gives you feedback on how well your changes are going down, and you can then course correct if something isn't quite working properly. So, examples of that might be that people are very nervous about coming back into the office because of the state of coronavirus. Conversely, they might be tearing their hair out at home and are happy to go through whatever, wearing a mask, making sure they don't socialize, keep their two meters, keep to their desk in the workplace environment, because they don't want to work from home anymore. So giving options is the best way to try and do it, because it allows you to adapt further as you move on.
It's not just in the workplace. Like, I think certainly in a lot of the workplaces that I've been in, Canary Wharf have been quite, you've got quite a bit of space as an employee. You do have your 2 meter sort of social distancing in lots of buildings, but that's not the only impact, really, is it? Because like if people are on public transport and you start bringing people back into the office without doing some sort of scheduled kind of rota of teams, etc., then you're just cramming people back into those other environments, which is exactly where we're seeing some of the problems probably occurring.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's about what's difficult as an employer is to see that whole experience for an employee. But I live my life every day, so I know, okay, I've got to go on public transport. In fact, I'll do a risk assessment of that. I've got to take the kids to school. I'll do a risk assessment of that. I've then got to get, and then when I'm into the office, I'll do my own personal risk assessment. So employers can only, to a degree, can only really affect what the things that they can control, but need to be aware of those other factors as well.
And I also think, it's based on trust. A lot of employers are now increasingly trusting staff because they rely on staff to deliver performance and products and services.
Yeah, it's fundamental. If there's one good thing that the pandemic has brought about, it's the increase in trust in employees, because organizations have had no other choice. They have to do that. And there is obviously software you can check what people are doing online all the time anyway. But I think that those, unless organizations have a compliance obligation to do things like that, I think we're seeing sort of less and less of that being certainly obvious to employees. It's much more about, we need to trust you to get on with your job, and people are responding to that, because people, on the whole, are decent people. They're not trying to waste time.
Yeah, so that goes back to your point about outcomes. We also got another comment here from David Norfolk saying other fears are overwork, because people are spending 8 hours on conference calls and then 8 hours catching up on all the work that has to be done, because calls don't get all the actions done, for example. So I mean, and certainly you do. I've been working at home for many years in this sector, of course, and you do actually give it more time. Like all of those hours that you would have spent traveling, you go, oh, it doesn't matter if I do a couple of extra hours because I'm conveniently at home. So you can squeeze a bit more in, but that means the employees are not getting their work-life balance if you keep pushing and pushing. And I think it's really, I guess, a pertinent time to consider how we've been told for so many years that computers are going to make our life better, yet they've made us work harder. So how do we get the benefit of this pandemic supporting employees and creating more jobs even, and making sure that we creating more jobs, because there's a hell of a lot of work there already that people are being forced to do more than 8 hours, so distributing that work, and then obviously making sure people do get their work-life balance, and that we can be part of pushing that driving that shift through.
Yeah,
I think you make a very good point, Marilyn, because for me, employee experience is based on two things. You've got one side is usability, so I've got the right equipment, the right access to be able to carry out a job function, and the other side is about having a balance between work life, and it's the two things that marry up together, which is how I would describe employee experience.
Yeah, and you've got to, part of that is you've got to empower employees or make them feel comfortable to say, I'm doing too much, or I've got too much work, and which has always been important, and employers have always been traditionally bad at, and that's just shifted from the office to kind of home life. The other thing to think about is, you said you've done it for a long time, Aaron, so you've probably got some of these techniques already, but it's about making sure you kind of, if it's about making sure what works for you. So for some people, setting set hours actually works in terms of the way they work. For others, they're actually more fluid, but to keep a track of the work you're actually doing is important to stop you, getting into that every night, every time at 9 o'clock at night you're still working, because there's always stuff to do. There's always stuff to do. And so there's an obligation both on employers and employees to start to understand how working differently and how you can manage it.
I think that's a very good point you've made there, Duncan. In our organisation, we've been redesigning workflow so that people managing work don't get overwhelmed if they see lots of work. They're just fed work that is to do in a time scale rather than seeing a big queue, so they don't worry about work building up. And the other thing is, I do think employees, because we're building trust, we don't need to monitor everything an employee does. However, by having a light touch monitoring, you can sort of spot if people are struggling,
Yeah.
if they're doing too much or too little. That's a good light touch intervention by employers.
Yeah, and if you hit on a key bit there, Ian, it's about how you use that information. If employees feel you are spying them because they're not doing enough, that's fundamentally not going to work. If you do a light touch check on them and say, is everything all right? Are you coping? What's the situation? Are you feeling overwhelmed? And can we do something to help? That's a much better way to approach that. Cool. I'm conscious we've kind of got 20 minutes left, so I'll move on to the next slide as long as there's no other questions or comments.
One
Okay.
comment there, but I do want you to keep going. Sort of, it's just
Okay.
a comment now is like, how is the employee's spouse affected?
Yeah, and it's from my own personal experience, when we first went into lockdown, my wife's actually a teacher, so she was having to both she was homeschooling our kids and online teaching as well at the same time, and it's kind of very hard. So we've managed to balance that out a lot better now. But again, that's come through experience. That's come through learning as the pandemic's gone on, and I think a lot of people have had to go through that as well. Okay, right. That's the kind of depressing bits. We'll get on to the perhaps more positive bit of the presentations now. And we'll talk about kind of what's important for employee experience now. And then I'll talk a bit later about what are some of the skills that everyone on this call will have that can help to improve the employee experience as we move forward. So one of the mistakes a lot of firms make is they approach employee experience in the same way as they approach customer experience. And some will just repurpose the same tools and methods in order to look at employee experience and going forward. That is convenient, but it misses a crucial point that serving employees is fundamentally different to serving your customers. And I'll talk you through three kind of key differences between the two. So one thing about employee experience is what you're really trying to do is to get people to bring their best selves to work every single day. The goal of customer experience through improvement programs, for example, is to get customers to be loyal to a brand, perhaps buy more of it, or be increasingly willing to recommend that brand to others. The goal of EX is fundamentally in any improvement program is to get people to be able and willing to bring the best selves to work and to give full attention to the work and do it to the best of their ability. It's a very different order doing that. Because it may require them to overcome, as we talked about, personal or emotional, physical barriers, or simultaneously manage their life experience, and that makes it much more challenging to drive good employee experience than to drive good customer experience. Secondly, the underlying psychology of employee experience is different. Customer experience practitioners benefit from considerable scientific research about customers' relationships with brands. So models such as the attachment aversion relationship is very important when you're starting to model and think about customer experience. Whilst there is some overlap between CX and EX, not denying that, and their underlying psychology, the differences are sort of significant. So the relationship employers have with their employees is not merely an occasional experience of when you buy something. It spans several hours every day, several days a week, and for years at a time. So the area of psychology that most applies to employee experience are things like job demands resources models. And that shows that to be able to sustain engagement work, people need a close match between the demands they face in the work and the resources they have to meet it. So the underlying psychology is different between the two. And then lastly, the factors that affect employee experience are different to those that affect customer experience. We have this thing called the Employee Experience Index research and the Employee Experience Index score. And we've identified 18 different factors that are statistically significant predictors of engagement, and 10 others that are strong predictors of disengagement and burnout among employees. If you put that together with other data sets, there are dozens of factors that affect your engagement as an employee, from how easy it is to find task-critical information that you need to do your job, to way the decisions that leaders take affect you in the organization. Some factors are so strong they can cause people to disengage and never fully recover. So losing a customer is bad, but losing an employee's willingness to engage fully in their work is much worse, especially in the light that it costs to remediate or replace someone who's totally unengaged. So, employee experience doesn't just equate to customer experience and about employees. It's a very different animal, and we have to approach it in a different way. So if those are some of the things that we have to think about when we talk about employee experience, the environment we want to create for people to bring their best selves to work really has to take account this idea of the purpose worker. So purpose worker are driven really in 3 ways. The most important is to make them empowered. So in our EX index, we looked at which work experience elements matter most for employees. And what we discovered was freedom to decide how best to do your job is the single most important factor. Employees want clarity about how their work contributes to company success and an environment that allows them to be productive. They want opportunities to advance and praise for work that they've done well. If employees have got autonomy, clarity, and growth opportunities, they're much more valuable to their employers, and they're much more happy in their work. So being empowered is important, but being inspired is important to workers as well. So employees want leaders who really live their company values and demonstrate their belief in the company and its core mission. They also want support in living those company's values and feel they can easily provide feedback to leadership. So where you talked Ian earlier about, perhaps lightly monitoring how your employees are doing, there's a flip side to that, and employees must feel comfortable that they can provide feedback on what's working and what's not. Inspired employees feel a real strong bond with their employers, especially when they feel good about the direction of the company. So that's another key aspect to this idea of the purpose worker. And lastly, they need to be enabled. So employees need to have the tools and resources that enhance their performance. So leaders have to make sure this human capacity and productivity is enhanced by providing the right technology, making sure they've got efficient access to necessary information that they need, and also, sufficient training in order to help them focus on the work and collaborate easily with their colleagues. When employees feel supported by the company in terms of tools and resources, they're confident in their ability to deliver their work. So again, this has always been important, but I think it's the change to making sure workers are enabled has really been accelerated through this current pandemic. But it's always been a factor that's important. So if that's what's important in terms of EX, and this is what's important to the modern sort of purpose worker, why am I really telling you this on this call? And what can you do about it? So I would argue that a lot of the skills that you fundamentally have or demonstrate in your work every day are crucial in helping to deliver an employee experience of the future. So one of the key things that I think, IT service management, IT asset management folk have is the ability to have listening skills and empathy. So behavioral studies have shown that people with very technically demanding jobs have less empathy for others, which can often explain why very technical staff have a reputation for saying no. And building a culture with empathy and listening skills requires people who can demonstrate these qualities. I believe that those sort of staff in IT service and asset management have the capacity for kind of awareness and growth to really enhance these things. Employers need to reward those who can demonstrate empathy and good listening. So programs such as pulse surveys, employee journey mapping exercises, listening sessions are all proven inexpensive ways of demonstrating the skills and improving the employee experience for all of your employees. Another skill that I think a number of us demonstrate is that curiosity and a willingness to experiment with ideas. Curious people have a natural urge to tinker and experiment without being afraid to make mistakes. Encouraging people to invest additional time to understand what personal apps employees are using for work, or what devices might make them more productive, is something that I think IT service management, asset management staff feel more comfortable with. But to help this, I think you're able to, or if you're able to demonstrate these sort of things, you become a key team member in really driving employee experience forward in your organization. Having a growth mindset is important. So when people commit to developing skills and talents through hard work and deliberate practice, and also feedback from others, this is what psychologists call a growth mindset. People who feel insecure or defensive about their abilities or don't believe they can change are the ones that lack this mindset. But to help improve that growth mindset, you really need to ask for coaching from your employers to really develop your ideas and talent and help to drive through a better employee experience. And I think one thing that increasingly you all will have is really being business savvy about what your organization does. To improve employee experience, professionals have to apply business knowledge to the delivery of employee and customer solutions. I think that probably sounds familiar to a lot of you. Just to give you some statistical backup, so 59% of global telecoms decision makers said that improving the alignment between business and IT to better leverage mobile technology to address business challenges was a high or critical priority. This is the work that you do every day. So making that connection between what you do and the business value that brings is possibly the most important thing you can do to really help drive your employee experience and achieve customer-facing goals. So as much as we started out with kind of the doom and gloom of where we are currently, I think each of you are uniquely situated and uniquely placed to help drive through a better customer experience within your organization. So again, I'll just quickly pause there, Marilyn and Ian. Are there any other questions or comments that have come up there? And I guess for everyone on the call is, do you recognise that you have those skills and that you're able to contribute?
Hello, we don't have any questions about the skills, but we do have another comment about in connection with spying on employees. I think there was an article on the BBC about an employer who was using software to spy on his staff.
Yeah.
I really don't think
it's
employees should be in that position in this day and age.
Yeah.
I think a lot of organisations have moved on from that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It fundamentally backfires every time, because as soon as it comes out, you lose huge amounts of trust within your organisation. What good organisations have realised, as we talked about a lot today, is about trusting your employees, because you can't, they're not in front of you every day, so you have to trust them to do their work. Now, the majority will repay that trust, and there will always be, small numbers who may not, and there will be contributory factors to doing that. So, as you talked about, Ian, about having some light touch where you say, look, things don't seem to be going well for you. Can I help? Can I do something? It's one potential way of doing it, but you have to be careful how you message that, so they don't feel they're being spied upon. But organisations that spy upon their employees are fundamentally self-defeating, because what happens is you absolutely destroy that trust with the organization and people become disengaged. And as I talked about in terms of what's an important psychological factor in employee experience, is once you disengage employees, it is hugely costly to bring them back into, whether you have to bring them back up to speed to get them engaged again, or whether they decide to leave and you have to bring someone else in. That's massively costly. So it's ultimately self-defeating to spine employees.
I think also in large organisations with the pandemic and an increase in people working from home for the first time, employee skill set is changing because a lot of training is now being delivered 100% online, which is a different user experience that employees on the whole have been used to, and employers are taking that into account as well.
Yeah, no, it's and it's again, it's about supporting and helping employees. It's not about spying on, because as David hinted to, this is we will get through this pandemic at some point, but we may well have another one around the corner. This is a fundamental change in the way we work, and you can either still have those very old-fashioned spy on my employees mentality, but as an organisation, if that's your mentality, you won't last long.
And it's interesting that that point comes up here. It certainly came up in the keynote presentation from Claire as well about, trusting your employees. If you don't trust your employees, like you said earlier, you're not going to have a business. You employ people to do a job. So I'm really quite interested that this is coming up as a concern here today still, about tracking employees and trusting whether they're going to do jobs. When you mentioned earlier that outcomes is the best way to manage people, and a lot of businesses are going into outcomes around managing IT as well. So we can't just sort of really not apply it in both areas to take those benefits. So I guess this is the pain point that's coming through from people. So one of the things I'd like to be able to make a difference in being able to bring that shift home for employers to trust employees. Like how do we keep that going?
Yeah,
Make
well,
an impact.
yeah, and it fundamentally comes back to why do I employ someone? I employ someone because they have the skills to do a job. I don't employ them so I have to tell them every day what they have to do. It's so I think in organizations where you have that culture, that if you really delved in deeply, I think you would, if you worked back through the process, you would find that the recruitment process isn't correct, so that they get wrong people in to do particular roles, and therefore a culture of, well, I'll have to do it for you is created. Therefore, when you go from that step, it's, well, I have to check on you in order for me to do it for you. And that's a wrong way to employ people. You employ people because they have the skills or some talent to do a role that you need them to do. So you need to support them and help them and train them to do that, but you need to get to the position where you can let them get on and deliver the outcomes you want. Because one, when you create a culture where people don't trust you, you're not going to last long. But secondly, it's not scalable. If you're constantly checking on what people are doing, you're not doing your job. So as
Agreed.
other organizations become more innovative, more agile, and go to market quicker, you're just going to be left further and further behind.
Yeah, good point.
And
Thanks.
we've got another point by David, who's talking about outcomes. That outcomes has been talked about for a number of years, but it's only now that something big happens that all of a sudden it's really more important and it's really at the forefront.
Yeah, and that's almost one of the things I was trying to hint at the beginning of saying, where nothing has changed, but everything has changed. So outcomes have always been important, but it's taken the push of this to really change a lot of employers to accept that and move down that direction. And there's a number of reasons for that. A lot of this is big generalization, but a lot of managers tend to have been in jobs for a long time, potentially come from a slightly more old-fashioned way of working, which was more sort of Tayloristic and about kind of how much time you're in the office as opposed to what you're delivering, and therefore that pervades through the organization. This situation has changed that, where you can't check on people, so you have to trust them, and so yeah, everything has changed. Nothing has changed in that was always important, but everything's changed in that people are now realizing that, and that's the only way forward.
Yeah. I think in the workplace, because of the rise in talk on well-being nationally, I think there's a much greater focus on well-being for employees in terms of delivering service excellence. I think a lot of organisations are taking a bit more interest in designing internal systems to deliver a good employee experience, whereas in the past it possibly focused a bit more on an external customer focus. And I think that shift towards internal systems and looking at employees is the right thing to do to support staff and their well-being.
Yeah, no, totally agree. Totally agree. Okay, so those are some of the skills that you can bring to bear, but I want to talk now about really moving from a very sort of traditional process-centric approach to an employee-centric approach, and some of the things you need to think about as you kind of move forward and adapt the way you deliver technology and to enhance the employee experience. So traditionally, IT service management has been slow to be adapted. It's been built very much, it's often been built around things like the Deming cycle, plan, do, check out. Now, the idea of that is to create a continuous improvement culture, but actually it often creates a culture about quality control. So you're compelling people to follow a process which has kind of started to backfire. ITSM has been slow to adapt. So, for example, the idea of service support means reacting efficiently to incidents that arise, finding underlying problems and making small changes to improve them or keep them from reoccurring. Whilst that's important, and things, for example, IT has things like service strategy. IT service management has not always been forward thinking enough to really drive disruptive change. This has also kind of left it behind in the sort of innovation game. So other disciplines like product management or lean startup have taken this lead in sort of innovation. The ITSM culture of process discipline and compliance will struggle to remain relevant as we adapt and change in this sort of age of digital disruption. So to kind of start to move away from this process-centric culture to an employee-centric one, you need to start doing a couple of different things. The first is learn how to think outside in. So this can be hard if your traditional way of working is about solving technical problems. From a cognitive science point of view, we know it's especially hard for people with technical jobs to really develop this empathy for others. That's a fact of actual human behavior, not a shortcoming in those people. To change it, you have to really connect with customer needs and employee needs. You have to understand how your work contributes to that and ensure you put the right incentives in place to help bolster and push forward this idea of thinking outside in. Okay, and I think incentives is a key one. So the way you measure and incentivize people absolutely drives the way they'll behave. So it's an important one to think about. Also, things like expanding the scope of employee self-service is important. There are proactive elements often in IT service management, but a typical implementation at an organization will have things like, we'll make sure we've got incident, make sure we've got problem, we'll make sure we've got change management, and that'll be it. And that doesn't really drive this good self-service. So we've done some research in this, and there's 25 priorities that we track for infrastructure decision makers, and employee self-service for apps and devices is one of the lowest, and that's not how it should be. If we look at our employee experience research, so that's on our information and operations side. If we look at employee experience research, it shows that those sorts of well-designed self-service things are crucial and key to creating this modern purpose worker. So it's something we need to think about very carefully. So we also need to think about how we kind of change our kind of operating model to move from an idea of efficiency and discipline to kind of creativity and productivity. So employee centricity and fast feedbacks really require this culture change within your organization. You have to move beyond technology and processes to address things like talent management and getting the right metrics in place. And by amending your operating principles, you can achieve some of these things. So the first is really one we've talked about for a long time, but it's key. It's really breaking down the silos in the interest of customer employee experience. So a traditional siloed command and control functional model that creates clear accountability and predictability really is not good in this new world because it creates too much work in progress. It's because you have to go back up and down the chain, it doesn't prioritize very well. It also means going back up and down that chain prolongs the decision-making cycle. And ultimately, because those people making decisions aren't sort of close to the coalface, it leads to poor service outcomes. What you need your teams to do is to sort of work together and stretch beyond the organization's four walls, really to their ecosystem of partners, because increasingly services are not provided just within one IT organization. It's done working with your partners and your external organizations as well, to really make sure that you meet customer needs and employee needs in their context. Really hold employee productivity as sacrosanct. So great employee productivity leads to great, as you talked about before, great employee experience leads to great customer experience. Okay. IBM did a study and showed 95 of those employees who report a positive experience with their company engaged in activities that were beneficial to their organization, which weren't necessarily part of the job. Excuse me. So they were doing extra things because they felt bought in and engaged. That number dropped to only 55% of employees who reported a poor experience at their company. So if you feel bought in and engaged with your organization, you're much more likely to step out of your role and try and help and improve things. Organizations that are strongly data and insights driven always do well here as well. So back in 2005, only 29% of firms we surveyed said they were good at translating their data and analytics into measurable business outcomes. So they had all the information, but they didn't know how they could translate that into really becoming a better business. So really, the best firms really become insights driven. They were customer obsessed, and they'd really drive towards things like master data enablement. So the process and systems required to make data available, clear, and secure to employees when they need it are really thought about and driven well within organizations. And then one of the most important things to drive in a focus on employee productivity is moving from speed over perfection. Now, we've developed over millions of years to be cautious about new things, because that's how we traditionally survived in the wilds. But what organizations do now are adopting very much quick experiences that are faster than ever before, and creating the idea of hyper adoption. The faster you're able to execute, the more quickly you'll win over your employees and your customers. But leaders are often nervous about doing this, and nervous about exploiting opportunities. They can get lost in bureaucracy and want to deliver bulletproof solutions, not a fast solution. So those four things are ways you can start to change organizations to really improve your employee productivity. Okay. A couple of other factors that are important are, the issue of great awareness and also time resources that are needed. So professionals often need to see and feel what employees experience in their daily work, otherwise you can't help to improve it. So proven methods of this include things like surveys, which can show you mismatches between the demands of a job and the resources you provide to them. Exercises like employee journey mapping really will show you where your gaps are and things that are harder to see. And then, some electronic methods of surveys, employee activity can help you as well, but obviously think carefully about those so that you're about improving the employee experience, not about spying. That sort of greater awareness of how your employees work will really help you to deliver a better employee experience. But in order to do that, you need the time and resources to lead those changes. So it's not just good enough to build awareness to improve employee experience. You need to be empowered to lead change with time and resources, and including that freedom to make decisions. So when we talked about old-fashioned ideas of command and control, where decisions go up and then come back down, it's much more important about making sure you have some guidelines so that people who are actually doing the work or are much closer to the work can make those decisions for themselves. We saw an example of a journey mapping exercise at a US regional hospital chain that revealed that meeting compliance requirements for dispensing prescription medication amongst nurses dramatically increased their workload, which actually increased the risks of them making mistakes. So we're not, when we're talking about dispensing the right medications here, so it's something that is fundamentally important. When the technology staff engaged in the journey mapping exercise, they fully understand the scenario, and they had a number of different ideas to how they could help the nurses with that. the best idea they came up with actually meant the organization had to invest in new technology. But without being able to see and engage and work that journey mapping exercise and understand that nurse-based employee experience, they would never have been able to improve that experience and then reduce the risk that wrong medication was given to patients, which is fundamental to an organization like a hospital. So I'd just like to now move on to sort of 5 principles that really can help you redesign your productivity in the organization. So rather than focusing on things like efficiency and productivity, what really you want to deliver to your employees are things that fuel the motivation and want them to improve the customer experience outcomes. IT service management alone is important, but it won't get you there. There's these 5 guiding principles you need to help you to improve that. So the first is this idea that making interactions pain-free. So this is one area where employee experience is similar to customer experience, because you want their experiences to be effective, easy, and to develop good emotions. But a key part of that is making sure those interactions are pain-free. So when you do process redesign, you've got to focus on actual behavior and needs of your workforce, not on just what you think the redesign needs. Adding things like communication channels like chat allows customers to easily engage with your service desk and give you feedback. Self-service and provide needs access to knowledge reduces the pain that employees feel as they're doing their job, and also reduces the pain of you delivering the service. So it works on both sides. Making sure that the services you provide are productive is important. So the important thing, the ability to get things done is important, not to employees, but also to external customers as well. So employees, important to customers, but also important to service delivery teams enabling the workforce. We've talked before about this idea of flow and kind of cognitive state of flow. To get employees into that where they're most productive, they need information to do their jobs when they need it. So it needs to be easy for them to find in order for them to be productive. Okay, so it also extends to the availability and performance of applications that they use in their day-to-day work. So they need the information and they need some tool or mechanism for them to be able to get the information easy. And then that allows them to be productive. So that's a key aspect of what you want to think about when you're developing services. Increasingly, we're seeing services are being personalized. So employees increasingly prefer to interact digitally. And that again has been driven, that's been accelerated over the past year. But that's not only within an organization to refer responsibilities, but also to engage with customers as well. So when you're thinking about service design and delivery, you need to shift to this much more personalized and consumer-like digital service. To do this, you need to have a persona-driven strategy to determine, who internal customers are, what they want, and then look at automation tools that allow customization, and even things like digital marketplaces or service app stores within your organization so that employees can find things quickly and easily that will support them. Okay, technology needs to be pervasive. Now, later on, Matt's going to talk about enterprise service management, so I won't steal too much of his thunder. But really, increasingly, we've seen non-technology areas in companies realize that they need service offerings or a portal, and something we like to call enterprise service management. That enables a service mindset to extend beyond the technology organizations. By managing demand and supply through a service app store or portfolio, you're able to really help other parts of the organization to really take advantage of the things we've always thought about and always done well in IT management. And also things like accelerating workflow automation through things like platform as a service or low-code developments really can help other areas of the organization learn and benefit from the things we've been doing for many years. And then lastly is think about trying to make your services predictive. So using things like analytics proactively can really help you understand what your employees' needs are and really help you enhance the quality and speed and value that you deliver to them. You can do things like quantitative assessments, like surveys or exercises to tailor new service offerings. but really understanding the employee experience, how they use those services, and all the other challenges allows you to make better decisions and operate much more efficiently. So thank you. That goes through everything I wanted to talk about today, and I appreciate your time for listening today. I appreciate all the comments and questions. Ian, Marilyn, are there any more questions or comments that have come up in that last section?
Thanks, Duncan. Just a few more comments, but we're going to hold them over now to the panel session because we've kind of run over time with so many comments and questions from, going throughout the process that we've used today. But everyone has actually stayed on with us right through to the end. So thank you very much for I appreciate you giving us that little bit of extra time to complete Duncan's session this morning. And really, thank you, Duncan, for coming in and presenting this topic for us today, because it's such a big area that really needs a lot of light shone onto it for people to be able to get that improvement as the employee and get a better experience.
Yep. Yeah. No. Thanks, Marilyn. It's as I said, it's something that's increasingly everyone's recognised how important it is now, which is a good thing.
Lovely. Okay, well, like I said, thanks very much for joining us, and we'll see you all today at the next session, which is at 1 o'clock today, where we've got Jim Hussey from the US, and he's going to be talking to us about it's a SaaS topic. It's a survival guide to SaaS, is I think his topic title now. So I hope to see you all here at many more of these sessions as we go through the next 3 days. But yeah, thank you very much for everything today.
Thanks.
Thank you.